Meeting to order. I want to welcome everybody who's attending in person or via phone. The first item on our agenda is the minutes from September 8th. We don't actually have minutes any longer. We're really posting the video. So there's really nothing for us to approve because obviously the video encompasses everything we did and talked about. I think Mike's going to be providing a synopsis of attendees and if we took any action during meetings to post on the website. But other than that, there won't be any minutes for us to approve at this point. So moving forward, I thought we would start with an update on the correctional facility. Is Gary here?
I'm here.
Okay, Gary, can you give us an update on the correctional facility?
Sure. Typically, we're running anywhere from about 120 to 130 persons in the building. We have a lot fewer individuals housed out of county. I believe when I just looked at it, we had 11 individuals housed in other counties. We still have challenges just because of COVID. Some of those areas, even though we have 186 beds, we have many beds that do not have cells. So that creates a challenge for us, especially with the pandemic going on. For instance, some of those areas, we have in excess of maximum security inmates at the moment. So our maximum security housing unit is full. Overflow is in the medium housing unit. It's caused us a surge of people in that medium unit to where we were back to housing individuals in the programs rooms. All that is just to try to make space available to kind of quarantine people the best we can when they first come in or they go out and come back into the building. Those are our challenges right now. We still are limited on bed space where cells are available. So while our numbers are down, we do appreciate everyone's efforts that have gone into keeping those numbers down, but we still do have some significant challenges ahead of us.
You don't have any more positive cases there, do you?
Not any additional other than the one that was recently reported. We had a treatment facility contact us because an inmate had symptoms Friday. We brought that individual back, sent in a test, and that individual came back positive. So he is isolated at the moment.
Does anybody else have questions for Gary? I think we're going to continue on with the stepping up.
Actually, I do real quick.
Oh, yes. Sorry.
I'm sorry. Gary, one of the things that we continue to hear a little bit about, and I know you guys have done a bunch of things to adjust how people are getting in and out of the facility. Are defense attorneys able to meet with clients in a private setting where they can confer about cases?
Yes.
Are you having any problems with that or any updates on that you can provide us?
No, I think I'd have to go back through my emails to when that changed. But initially, when the pandemic started, we eliminated general outside visitors. So what we did was we took those visitation booths and made those available for attorneys to utilize. Basically, you're talking by a handheld phone through glass, face to face. Here recently, after a number of complaints, we reverted back to the way that we once had it. So right now, attorneys, as long as they're wearing appropriate face masks and practicing social distancing, they can meet as they always did in the attorney visitation rooms face to face. Or if they don't feel comfortable doing that, they can still utilize the general visitation area through the glass.
Okay, thank you. So in effect, at this point, if a defense attorney wants to go out and review a plea offer or anything like that with the client, they should have adequate access to them.
Yeah, and it's been that way for some time. I'd have to go back and look. I had accidentally left you out of the email that I had sent to Judge McCaberia on that, but that was some time back. We made that change, opening the in-person face-to-face visitation booths back up.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Any other questions for Gary? Thanks, Gary, for the update.
You're welcome.
I'm going to move on to the third item, stepping up initiative. Judge McCaberia wanted to be involved in the racial and ethnic disparities discussion, so he's not at the meeting yet, so I think we'll move on to the stepping up with Mike.
One second while I adjust my screen. All right, I have two screens and I think I need three, but well, so bear with me. That I don't want to spend a lot of time on this because we have discussed about the new goals setting for stepping up that they've issued as a challenge that was rolled out last week as they celebrated 5 years of stepping up initiative. In fact, for Douglas County, it was 5 years ago, October 2015, that we passed our resolution to join stepping up. And so we wanted to kind of issue a new challenge, and they've been working with the innovator counties over the last year to get an idea of what would be appropriate to set for goals for counties to achieve. And they've listened to feedback and asked us to put some numbers together as we so we can provide some feedback. So I said last week was the official launch of Set, Measure, Achieve. And it's maybe more of a concrete way of beginning to, for counties to have some concrete progress in moving forward. So I'm just going to roll through the areas they've asked us to set goals and what the goals would be like for Douglas County. Maybe. There we go. So the first goal is they asked us to reduce jail bookings of people with serious mental illness by 10%. And so our 3-year average from 2017, 18, and 19 was 7.3% of our bookings were persons with a serious mental illness. So our goal for 2021 will be 6.5%. The next area they wanted us to look at was to reduce the length of stay. And so for people with serious mental illness, the length of stay from 2018 to 2019 was 45 days. And our goal will be to reduce that to 42 days in 2021. The next area was a 5% reduction in the average standing jail population, which is a little bit different than bookings. When you looked at the length of stay numbers, our average length of stay is 45 days. Average length of stay for someone in the general population is closer to 16 days, I believe. So that creates this scenario where, although only 7.3% of bookings are someone with a serious mental illness, when you look at the standing jail population, about 18% of the population is someone with a serious mental illness. And so our goal will be to reduce that to 17% next year. And certainly we have some recommendations coming from SAMHSA for ways to do that. The third area or fourth area they asked us to look at was to track connections to care. So these are referrals from the criminal justice system to our stakeholder treatment agencies, that'd be DECA, Heartland Clinic, Bert Nash, and others. And we don't do that electronically right now. We have a pilot program in place to work on that. And so we want to establish our baseline data so that we can set goals from there. Then looking at recidivism, from the Council of State Governments report, in 2018, persons with serious mental illness returned to jail within 6 months. That was 66% of persons released from jail with serious mental illness. So that's a high number, especially when you compare, I believe the reentry population was just over 40% for that same year. So people with serious mental illness definitely are returning to jail at a much higher rate. So our goal for 2021 will be to move that number to 62%. So so as I said, we have some recommendations coming from our sequential intercept mapping project with SAMHSA. We'll be sharing those with you once the Stepping Up work group has been able to review those. But one of the things that Stepping Up is challenge innovator counties to do is to establish a data dashboard where we would be able to post quarterly updates on these numbers. And so Dr. Cravens has been working to draft what a data dashboard may look like. And this is our start at that. And so this would give us the opportunity to share with the community, share with our stakeholders where we're at in achieving these goals. And so one thing, when we get the dashboard up and running, we would like to then have the goals stated by each of these measures. So that is all of the presentation I have on that. Did anybody have any questions or anything? It's something we've talked about a fair amount, so, but be glad to field any questions.
Thanks for the update, Mike. We'll jump back to the first item on racial and ethnic disparities with Mayor Ananda.
Hello, everyone. So in our racial and ethnic disparities work group, we have been discussing data, and Matt has been phenomenal in bringing us loads of data and certainly indulging all the questions that we have and looking for the information that we're requesting. And one of the conversations that we had at our last meeting, and it's kind of been an ongoing conversation, is what is the goal with this data? What are we looking to achieve? And we've had many discussions about that, and I don't know that we've created any clear outcomes. We wanted to bring this to the CJCC so that we could have a conversation about what is the CJCC's goal with this data? What kind of information are we looking for, and how can we most effectively use Matt's time in the research that he's doing so that we can continue to move this project forward? So I will open it up. It's wide open for discussion. Certainly, we want to hear what your thoughts are. Some of the, I can tell you some of the dialogue that we've had through the work group. There was conversation about finding what the decision points are and what those options are within those decision points, from A to Z in the criminal justice system, starting with a stop. And that certainly will drive us toward very micro data on those pieces. There were also, I will say, I certainly want us to be able to maintain our focus on the systemic piece of the racism that is being experienced when pulling out, those individuals, which is obviously important. There's that macro piece as well. What are the policies, procedures, statutes, ordinances in place that are disproportionately impacting our community, and how do we most effectively use data to find those issues? And so it's a little bit of both and without direction, to pull every single decision point might be, it's going to be a lot of time and a lot of energy and a lot of effort, which is completely worthwhile in many aspects. And there is, by doing that, going to be pulling away that focus from that really macro systemic issue of, making those individual opinions obsolete by creating a system that is just and based in equity. So hopefully that helps bring some conversation to the table. I know Judge McCabria wanted to have some dialogue around that, but others, we want to hear from you. And other members of that group, please feel free to chime in pieces of that conversation that I've left out.
I think it may be helpful just to have maybe Matt talk a little bit about his experience working with the data so far, what types of things he's been looking at, and where he thinks we can maybe go with some of that. I know I'm putting you on the spot there, Matt, but I think it'd be really helpful for this group to know as a whole kind of what the data looks like that we're working with so far.
Yeah, that's a good idea. So the racial disparities work group sort of challenged us to start thinking about where the racial disparities arose, because back in June, we did a presentation showing that there were some differences between the white and Native American and white and Black groups in terms of how likely they are to be booked into jail, how likely they are to be incarcerated in the jail, and then their length of stay too. And we kind of thought we need to break it down into decision points, or sort of points at each stage of the justice system, to see where those disparities might arise. So I started a broad net of analysis, and I started looking at, for instance, the types of offenses that people of different racial groups tend to be booked into jail for. And there were some differences, especially in terms of DUIs and so forth, but nothing that really explained any of the disparities we saw before. Then I looked at bond amounts. So we were actually thinking about maybe presenting some of that bond data today, but we're going to hold off until later. But looking at basically whether certain racial groups are receiving higher bond amounts for certain types of offenses or not. And there's some interesting differences there, but not a lot to explain the length of stay differences we saw in previous analyses. And then also the DA's office has been very great in giving us access to some of their data on felony cases. And so we've been looking to see what the likelihood of your felony being amended down to a misdemeanor or infraction is. We also looked at, and we didn't find any racial differences there, but we also saw if maybe people sentenced to jail are more likely to have a longer sentence if they're Black, white, or Native. And then people's prison sentences, whether or not they're more likely to be incarcerated with a longer prison sentence if they're Black, white, or Native. And we were able to control for a number of things like criminal history and felony misdemeanor level, sort of offense level. And we found some difference in so far in the prison time. It looks like Black defendants are getting about a month longer than white defendants, all else being equal, but there's no difference we found in the felony cases going to jail, which is interesting because there's just a lot of interesting results that are sort of coming of that. So these are just some examples of the data analysis that we've done. Hopefully that sort of sheds some light on this. One of the question marks is criminal history. I've been able to sort of control for the number of past bookings people have in DCCF, and also your Douglas County resident status, to sort of get a sense of, for Douglas County residents, like if you are booked into jail a lot in the past, can we control for that to see if that changes your bond amount or how long you're sentenced to jail and so forth. And it's good to control for that, but a lot of times we don't have data on your criminal history score that's set by the pre-sentence investigation. And that would be useful to have in some settings. So, not having criminal history is a barrier that we have to overcome. And I think there's some question marks about whether or not we should do certain analyses if we don't have criminal history or not. And so that's another question mark that we have. I hope that gives people a little flavor of some of the things we're doing. And we're also mapping arrests in Douglas County with GIS software. The ArcGIS team in the Douglas County is helping us sort of analyze where disparities might be occurring in terms of geography of arrests. So hopefully that'll shed some light on possible racial disparities here in the next month or so.
So I guess I have an apologies for being late, coming from teaching. Mayor Nanda, I guess I want to ask a clarification from you. So you saying are you wanting us to sort of talk about what other questions we might have based on this, or like sort of new directions to take some of this, or?
That's a good question. I think that we're struggling with exactly what you're saying. Is this a research project? You need enough information to know that there's a problem, and we have that. But what is the goal? Is the goal to find where these points are and address them micro? Is it to look at the policies that impact those decisions? Is it a research project, where we're making a hypothesis and moving in that way?
Then now that I have that, I want to echo then what you have already said, and if that is worthwhile to this discussion. I do think that one thing CJCC can do, at least as I'm learning it, is as a convening of all of these various units and constituencies, is to perhaps create or suggest some sort of triage, some sort of list of priorities. And what you had already said about kind of looking at the macro and how that shows up in policy sounds like one way that if Matt's able to map these points, like these are the places where the greatest disjuncture, the greatest disparity lies, then I would be interested in saying how can we map that onto actual policy recommendation shift, or pointing all of these various bodies to what can you do about this?
Thanks, Darren.
Yeah.
Are there other thoughts?
I think the difficulty is it's so complex that sometimes in the committee, it feels like we're getting in the weeds and maybe not getting at what we want to know. And I wondered if maybe we focus some attention on sentence populations like community corrections and court services, since we know what their scores are in terms of their criminal history. And maybe look at that. I mean, we're not going to know that from the jail perspective, but we would at least know that about the clients that we have in town that are Douglas County residents. I didn't know if that would be helpful. I mean, it's going to be a lot of work, but any of this is a lot of work. I don't know what your thoughts about that, Matt.
Yeah, I think that looking at the sentence population in the jail would be very good, because we found that, for instance, the black-white disparity in jail time is greatest for the sentence population. On the other hand, we did find that bookings were very disproportionately Black, and there's, at an earlier stages, there's a lot of disproportionality that seems to arise. Like for instance, the law enforcement booking does seem to be, or arresting does seem to be disproportionately Black, and that's where a lot of the disparity seems to arise. So that's why we wanted to look at the arrest locations of GIS data. But I think it is very fruitful to look at the sentence population. Perhaps the DA's office can give us some more data on misdemeanor cases. So we've started to look at felony cases already. And so perhaps looking at misdemeanor cases would be good, because a lot of those folks are heading to the jail, and seeing what the sentence population is like, and just getting more data would be great. Like, I wonder, what limitations Spillman might have. And there might be some limitations we run up against, but perhaps the DA's office or full court in the court system might be able to give us a little bit more diverse data.
Yeah, I don't know where the LSIR score is kept. It tells you at least what their score is for historical criminal behavior. At least it would give you an idea, since that seems to be one of the things that drives that we can't seem to touch. This is criminal history.
Matt, can I ask a question? I don't know. We'll see. When you use the word interesting to talk about disparities, what does interesting mean? What I'm trying to, I know it's a qualitative word, so I'm trying to get my mind around. Are we saying like, yeah, what does interesting mean in that case?
The disparities are obviously unfortunate, and we need to solve them, and we need to find out basically where the disparities arise so we can tackle them. When I say interesting, in terms of a data perspective, I'm just talking about potential areas that might help explain the racial disparities in length of stay we've seen. So when I say interesting, I just mean like, oh, there could be some divergence in the race groups in terms of like types of offenses they're charged with or things like that. So I didn't mean to imply like the disparities were good. I'm just trying to say it could be an avenue for future research that would be useful to look into to help uncover some of the reasons for the disparities.
No, and let me be clear. I knew that you weren't saying it was good. I knew there was something. It sounded like there was something else behind it, and that's what I'm sort of wanting more of. If we can pin down, I mean, I know it's not fair to put you on the spot to say give me these explanations, but I am invested in finding out behind that. Interesting. You are saying actually, I do think that this is the place where there might be a shift that we should look at. This is a thing that we should look at. I am interested in that in particular.
I think part of this conversation too is we can pull whatever data we need, but what do we want to see coming out of that data? What is it? Is it recommendations? Is it just information for folks to have, an awareness of what those are, and then letting those groups kind of take that? Is it what does that look like? I think that's a part of this as well, because we can pull data all day. It's helpful and important, but if we don't know what we're going to do with it, then there's no point to it.
Absolutely. Agreed. I'm interested in recommendations, for whatever that's worth.
Well, and I think what Professor Kennedy said and what I hear Marinanda saying in my mind is really, I think, the little bit of time that I've been involved in CJCC and tried to catch up to how things are working. I had this conversation with Mike and a little bit in an email exchange with Matt, in that, I think Mike and Matt are both digging into the information and they're presenting us with interesting information. Interesting to me just means that caught my attention. I wonder what's behind that. And I believe I know that there are people on this committee who have different perspectives on what's interesting and what they think the explanations might be behind that. And so if there is a way for the committee to take this data, discuss it, and say to the researchers or to each other on the committee, what else do we need to know to satisfy the interest that particular data point piques for us? And I just think that that helps us help Matt and Mike drive towards the data that might help answer that. But I think data is critical, and I've learned so much from what they've presented to us, but I also think there's just limits to what data can tell us. And there are perspectives of people who are participating in the system who can add information onto that. And if the ultimate goal of CJCC is to educate each other with those different perspectives, then that's going to be, in large measure, my definition of success of CJCC, because some of these interesting data points may have explanations that, once we pour all of our collective experience into it, our interest is satisfied. And it hasn't been from a data standpoint, but there's other dynamics that the data can't answer. And I suppose to cast that in a slightly controversial way, I would say that when we use the word disparity, the presumption that I've been taking from that term as it's being used in the discussions is disparity relative to the overall demographics of the community. Do those disparities change if we start to analyze the numbers in a different way? What percentage of any part of the community is engaging in behaviors that bring them into the attention of law enforcement? And I know that opens up a whole nother can of worms that goes beyond perhaps what CJCC, or maybe not. I mean, I think I still don't have a solid understanding of what some of the members of CJCC envision as maybe some of the goals that can be accomplished or defined by the members of the committee. And, when the county commission set this up, they had a goal in mind, but I don't think that should limit the members from putting out there, when I use the word frustration, I don't mean it in a negative sense. I just can't come up with a better word right now. There's things I think could be looked at or explored more, but I'm one voice. And so maybe others don't have those same frustrations, but I just think there's ways that we can help Matt and Mike know what we are interested in, and that helps tailor the types of research that they can do. But I know that's a very broad statement as well, so leave it at that.
Judge, I appreciate you bringing those up. I think that those are considerations that we need to carry, and that, when we look at who is committing crimes, we're looking at in an intervention phase, who is being caught committing crimes and where is that focus, right? On what population? And that is potentially to some extent, although we've been asked to consider, who is reporting and why. Why are the police being called, and to what extent does that have to do with race? I think that data has shown that the same percentage of crimes are committed, if not more, by the white population. And yet we see a disproportionate amount of our Black population experiencing arrest. I think that we also are talking about, when we talk about criminal history, looking at the school to prison pipeline, because of that focused attention on Black residents, our American Indian residents, and our Hispanic residents. And so how does the CJCC address that? If criminal history is something that, is out of our control, aside from, potentially making recommendations to our state legislature to reconsider that, how do we address that? How do we address the impact that criminal history has when we know that some folks are targeted more than others? It becomes complex.
Yeah, and I think that is exactly the sort of thing, because I guess, and again, I admit not being sophisticated about this in the way that I would like to be, but at least if we define what the drivers are, then that helps give us perspective on what effect are the internal drivers having. There's external forces that are producing certain outcomes. I see one concern or goal of the CJCC should be to help the people who are part of this committee question, okay, there's these external factors certain assumptions that we make that drive how we do our job. If we know what those are, it helps us better analyze what we're doing in response to that. I mean, if you bring me, 500 widgets and 10, can't remember the other economic term, gadgets, there's going to be a disproportionate impact on actions the court takes against widgets. And so I just feel like there's experience that layers on top of the data that's out there that both should tell what data we should be looking at, and then how is that being interpreted by the committee, the perspectives on the committee. Maybe some people think, that leads us into other areas to explore, but I don't know what the limits of what the committee feels like where they want to go with those things. So
that's what we're here to ask you.
Say again.
That's what we are here to ask you, because the world is our oyster, really, when we're looking at this data, and we could pull data for years. But if we don't have a direction in which we're headed, then we're just turning our wheels.
That I agree, and that's my invitation to the committee, is to figure out how they want to, from their perspective, what they would want to seek out. We've increased our interaction with Matt and Mike, and I hope that that's been helpful to them, and to the extent that other committee members, either in whatever fashion, I don't know the best way to address this, but I appreciate that it's being brought up, and I think they're maybe giving some thought to crafting a question that can be voted on, or a topic that can be discussed with recommendations coming out of that. Just not just data being poured into us and Matt and Mike trying to decide what to do with it or guess what we want, but to give them that feedback. So
this is Mike Patrick. Is it possible that we talked about all these different components of what we're going to call the systemic racism or systemic problem, that we have law enforcement at the beginning, we have prosecution, then we have pre-sentence, and then we have incarceration? Can all of that data be put into those boxes basically, and then brought to, let's say, the law enforcement component, because that's what part I'm in, that you bring all that data together in that compartment about what it is we need to look at, and then bring to all of the members who are on the CJCC who are in law enforcement to look at that data and help try to interpret some of that from a experience perspective. And then each one of the compartments take a look at that, but that committee actually put those in those boxes for us so we can look at those individually. Is that possible?
So you're saying package it essentially by area of profession, the data that we have. Okay.
Yes. And because it sounds like you have just enormous amounts of data that are in certain sections. Some of it deals with incarceration rates. Some of it deals with pre-sentencing. Some of it deals with what the adjudications are. Some of it, what's being prosecuted, what's not. But then the first part of that is who's being arrested and who's not. And all of that data, instead of putting it all together and having the committee look at all of that in total, put it in those boxes, and then have the individuals who have expertise in those basic boxes help take a look at that.
So it's really kind of like the decision point, the law enforcement decision point, the prosecutor decision point, where the decisions are made.
I think conceptually that's a long ways towards what I'm been thinking about. Just I don't know how to say to do that, but conceptually I like it.
I think that there's space for dialogue among the broader CJCC as well, because these are all interacting and intersecting throughout this process. You know, the police contact the jail, the police are in the courtrooms. You know, I think that there is space for a broader conversation on this. So if that were going to be the thing where we say, here's what we found for law enforcement, I'm going to stick with what you used as an example. I wouldn't want to just package that up and send it, you know, with gift wrap to law enforcement. I would want to have a public conversation where, you know, we could get broader input on the findings of that, and then take it to those spaces for an intentional dialogue around that data. And I think that if we were going to use a process like that, we could take what we have now and just do that. And I wonder, you know, what folks' thoughts are on that.
I'm going to sound like I'm just repeating myself, but I just want to agree again with Mayor Ananda, partially because I'm here as a community member. And so if the goal becomes to package those things and just send them off to those sort of operative constituencies, then I'm not entirely sure what the purpose of the community members on CJCC becomes. It seems to me that it becomes important to have that kind of either broader CJCC recommendation dialogue or public forum that then that gives some sort of discussion, some sort of apologies, some sort of directives of ways of before those operatives have to dig in, so that there's an understanding of what either broader CJCC or the community actually is responding to in some of this data.
So let me try and develop a little bit more, because maybe I misunderstood what Mike was saying. And I invite Mike Patrick, I invite Mike Brower, Matt Cravens to chime in. What I heard Chief Patrick saying is, giving the data as it exists to law enforcement, and then having a period where law enforcement can interface and help the researchers clarify their understanding, or maybe understand what the interpretations are reflecting. And that's sort of, maybe I'm hearing that because that's what I feel like the courts have been doing, myself, Judge Simpson more than me even so, in helping look at what the data is that Matt in particular is looking at, and give some better perspective on understanding what that piece of information reflects. And then once they have that, to be able to, it's not to not share it with the group. I just feel like, the benefit to the researchers is to have that perspective, so that they're giving us data that doesn't have certain assumptions or missing components to why something might exist. And then of course to bring it to the entire committee and have that discussion. But I just feel like Matt and Mike are sort of having to comb through this information without having some of that feedback. And Matt, I don't know if I'm explaining correctly the sort of effort that I think the judges are trying to make, and whether that's been helpful. Maybe it hasn't been.
Yeah, I think whenever you do a data analysis, you need some guidance from the experts who know the data. And for instance, when we were analyzing the DA's office data, an assistant DA, Dorothy Klein, and their IT data guy, Dylan Wah, were both very helpful in sort of informing me about what the data meant and any assumptions I was having about the felony cases in the data and so forth. And, Judge Simpson was very helpful in helping me with the court's data too. So I think that'll be a useful step regardless of what kind of data we're analyzing, because sometimes there's not quality, some variables are just not good, and it's good to know where the quality data is in the data set that people are giving me. And so, yeah, having to work with the person, with the agency or the office that's giving me the data is always an important step. And I know like LPD has its own data folks, so at some point it'll be useful to kind of connect with them. But I think, yes, I think that'll be useful regardless of who we share the results with. I think, yeah, doing that as a first step is always helpful.
Mike Patrick, am I following up on what you were suggesting, or am I going
Yes,
off
you
on
are. Yeah, there was in no way, if I gave the impression that I didn't want this to be a public conversation, that's definitely not it. I just wanted to say that there are several people on this committee that have several years of experience in that field and would be able to share some type of perspective to help analyze that data, to try to give some talking points even about what that could or could not mean. Not that we would want to cut anybody out of that conversation, but just to provide some type of experience, expertise in that field.
I appreciate Judge kind of teasing that out. And my experience on that subcommittee is that there are a lot of folks who do have that experience on that subcommittee. So it's not operating in a vacuum without that professional experience. And so those conversations are happening, just like Matt mentioned that he's working with Judge Simpson. And so that was kind of a foregone conclusion for me that is occurring, but we can certainly redouble those efforts to ensure that the data that we're pulling is like pulling the consideration factors that are part of that, like Matt mentioned around the felony data. If there is information that is coded in a certain way within a system, I think it's very important for him to know that.
Yeah, and if I may just ask for some clarification, listening to Chief Patrick and to Darren, is I almost see this process where Matt kind of analyzes the raw data, goes to the professional decision makers. 'Cause I think it could be multiple people. It could be prosecutor and defense counsel in some situations. Get it. Are we looking at this correctly? Is this the right interpretation? Are we missing pieces? Then take that information to the work group and have those same conversations. We've had some really good conversations around those things and have gone back and redone or gathered some additional data points. And then add this piece where we have a conversation with the community, and especially community members who have been engaged in the system. And now we gather not just our quantitative data, but we add some qualitative data from people's experiences to that as well. And that's the information that we publicly present through the CJCC.
Mike, I appreciate what you just said. That's sort of the big picture, and that brings it back to where Professor Kennedy just mentioned. As the community, I feel like the people who are in the system, the prosecutors, the law enforcement, the community corrections officers, I feel like the biggest, maybe biggest is wrong, an important perspective that I would love to hear from are the community members, because we get our myopic view of how we think our part runs. And I think one value of CJCC is to hear those other perspectives, but more than anything, I perceive that CJCC exists to help be responsive to the community, to get information out. And if we don't know, if we find it interesting in our little niche of the system, that's great. And I've learned a lot from that. But I want to get that dialogue and I want to get that information out. And, the courts, law enforcement, I think, want to be responsive to what the community's expectations are. And so in that light, I don't know if that means that, I don't want to presume what level of understanding may be very sophisticated or not that the community members on the committee have. And if there's presentations that the court can give to help explain certain things, I'm glad to offer that. But I feel like, those abstract questions to me are the most probative of what we can help answer for the community's perspective. So
I'm kind of hearing, we in our subcommittee have been trying to drill down to outcomes in a lot of ways, as we've gotten very specific in the data that we're requesting. But what might be more useful then is a broader overview with some of the data that we already have in the GIS mapping. I'm very excited for that. I think that's going to be really useful information. And perhaps we take that information and bring it to the CJCC after those dialogues, so that we can have a broader community dialogue about what we're seeing. And perhaps, we are the system. The people who are in the system are the people who are experiencing the system. And I think that having that perspective is vital. That qualitative piece, which is less simple, I think, a lot of times than the quantitative data that we pull. And that's going to be probably the key piece for any kind of recommendations or changes that are made for those parts, those professional settings to consider as they look at what they're going to do in response to that. And then I think that the last piece that we would need is then a report out, once that has been digested and considered through those professions, is a report back to the CJCC about any changes that have been implemented, so that we can reassess the impact of those changes as we move forward.
May I make a request based on that then? And this comes from both Mayor Nanda, to your point, and Judge McCabe from your point, and based on my own ignorance. What would be useful then for me is to get a, for lack of a better term, a citizen's timeline through their encounter with the criminal justice system here in Douglas County, right? That says, from first interaction with law enforcement, assuming that that goes up through arrest, pretrial booking, etc., that gives me a timeline and then maps onto it the points that have been looked at with this data, so that we know, so that I can get a sense of where right now we're suggesting there may be, and these are just words that are in my mind, where there may be disruption, where disparity is being injected, or at least the points where we're saying, okay, this is a place where we're thinking something needs to be looked at. Because if I can get a sense of not only what that gives me, a human experience of what it is that someone is actually experiencing with the criminal justice system, and also maps on for it to me where we're looking at, even currently, how those data points interact with that experience. Does that make sense?
Yeah, are you asking that? I mean, I think it's tricky to get someone to volunteer to do that. And so how we would do that would have to have careful consideration, I think.
Gotcha.
But I wonder if you're talking about them coming and speaking to the CJCC to that, or if it is Matt collecting that narrative. I don't know what your experience is with qualitative, but
yeah, wondering if Matt could create that, or collect that data, as opposed to I'm not at a place where I'm thinking, let's have interviews, lifetime movie monologue. That's not where I'm thinking CJCC is, right? At least not right at the moment. Maybe someone else thinks that. That is not me.
Matt, can you speak to that at all? Is that something?
Yeah, I'll have to get a little bit better sense of what we mean by that qualitative component. I haven't done a lot of qualitative research, but you're not necessarily talking about doing interviews or anything with people. You're just talking about sort of what questions along the sort of timeline of where the citizen interacts with the system, what questions it answers, what each data set sort of answers.
Yes.
And I think I can kind of describe that to folks as I do an analysis. I think that seems very reasonable, and I can do my best to do that.
Okay. That the timeline. If there's a place that I can hang some clothes on the clothesline, yes, a timeline would be useful.
I mean, there's such a rich field to start, there's timelines of events that occur that draw no or little law enforcement attention. And there's a whole tree of ways, those decision trees that can go through that never result in later participation in the system. So, it's big. And so when I hear this timeline, what I'm presuming is the question is, from all of those points where decisions are made that ultimately result in the person finding their way into a post-sentencing outcome. But we can't lose sight of the fact that there are, I will humbly submit, hundreds, if not more, trails that I think shed light on that one trail. And it's easy for us to think that those represent the criminal justice system. They represent one aspect of the criminal justice system. And that's where if that's where our focus wants to be, that's perfectly acceptable to me. I just think it's worth taking a step back to say there's lots of other dimensions to the system that if we keep our focus there, that we're not analyzing, and we're not analyzing how those impact that one track. If that makes any sense. I'm probably not articulating it well.
And I just threw this up. This is a document I put on here. It's about 12 years ago. It's from Johnson County. It was designed to look at mental health interaction or mental illness interaction in the criminal justice system. But is this kind of what you're talking about, Darren? And we would need to add what we call decision point 0 here, which is prior to contact law enforcement. And we could start on this and begin to add these different decision pieces in there and
And
meet with.
I guess part of what, yes, so to answer your question, Mike, absolutely yes. And
Yep.
Judge McCabe had to be a little bit, I absolutely hear what you're saying, that there are lots of trails. I guess part of what I am not sure about right now is are the data points that we're already looking at, are they tracking us along one of those trails? Are those data
Right.
points all over the tree, the trail map, for lack of a
Yeah.
better term? And so I'm trying to even get my mind around, well, if we do have this data, is it pulling us along a certain path, or is it looking at a broad range of that path, that map?
I think great question. I think the thing that Mike just had up there, I couldn't see it while I was talking, but when I blew it up, I mean, I think that does a good job of indicating there's lots of trails. And I feel like if we're talking about outcomes for sentencing and people who are in custody, we are focusing on one aspect of the many trails that are out there. And that is, I'm not afraid of that. I welcome it. But I just think it's worth keeping that perspective in mind, and then asking ourselves as the CJCC, as the courts, that's really the only path, that's the primary path that I'm going to deal with on a day-to-day basis. Does the CJCC want to look at other paths, and where can the greatest impact be? If our primary concern is the people who are making it into the sentencing outcome, what are the factors that get you to that point on through the system versus the other outcomes that are possible? If that makes sense as a way to analyze where we want our focus to be.
I'm hearing there's a desire perhaps to pull data, at least some information to indicate this is a data point that needs to be dug into further, or not. At every point within that process is the preference of the CJCC for what we bring back to you all. Is that what I'm hearing?
I think so.
Yeah,
Okay.
I'll get behind that.
Okay.
Well, thanks. This has been a great discussion. We've got a couple more items we need to move on since we're running out of time. The next item is the Advancing Racial Equity Role of Government Implicit Bias Training with TA Branson.
So we've been rolling along with getting this ready. The training right now is set for December 3rd. This is the Advancing Racial Equity, the Role of Government. This is going to be the base training that really we're trying to invite a lot of partners into, people in the county and city. All we have, I believe, space for 65 people in this. We think we'll be able to fill up most of that pretty easy. But this is the base training that Gare really wants everybody to have. It'll be the basis for anybody else that wants to do any type of racial equity toolkit work that they should have. So we'll be announcing this real soon here and getting the invites out on this in the next week or so. So we're pretty excited about this. We think it's going to be a nice piece. I know folks over in the city have been really excited about it too. We've been talking about it a lot in our small section here of our subcommittee work group.
Great. Thank you. Last on our agenda this morning is State of Kansas Criminal Justice Reform with Mallory Lutz with the Little Government Agency. I think I saw Mallory. Yep, she's there.
Hi, it's nice to see a couple of familiar faces. I don't know the majority of you though. So my name is Mallory Lutz. I'm with Little Government Relations. We have been, I should have asked first, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, great. We have been working for the county for about 1.5 years now on obtaining state funding for the Crisis Center. And we're continuing to do this work, focusing on ensuring that we get ongoing annual funding for the Crisis Center, but also expanding our work with you all to focus on criminal justice reform and of course other items of interest for the county, such as property taxes and issues related to home rule. But obviously I'm here today to talk about criminal justice reform. So we've begun having conversations with the county about these issues and efforts that are happening at the state level and locally. I'm here today simply to provide you with a big picture look at what is currently being discussed at the state level when it comes to these issues. I'll start off kind of with a couple of disclaimers, so to speak. I'm not here to convince you necessarily to pick any of these, one over the other or steer you in any particular direction. I'm just here to tell you about these issues and opportunities over the next session and how the county might be engaged in some of these conversations. I'm also not an attorney, so I'm not here to weigh in any capacity on any of these issues or proposals. A couple of other things I'll mention before I jump into some of the specific proposed items. So we're obviously anticipating that the 2021 session, probably more so than any other session in a long time, will be focused on criminal justice issues. We don't know, though, to what degree these conversations, obviously about the state budget and revenue shortfalls, are going to overshadow not only these issues, but literally everything else. I mean, the state still has to figure out how they're going to fix this $1.3 billion revenue shortfall. One other thing I'd add to that, a lot of the legislators and people that would be engaged in a lot of these criminal justice conversations over the interim, they have really been mired in other conversations more so related to KEMA and the Kansas Emergency Management Act, and how that might need to be updated and fixed so that if we were to ever have another pandemic, which hopefully we don't in a very long time, how that is better able to respond to some of these things. And so we just are not sure exactly what these conversations might look like just yet. And we don't even know exactly what the legislative session will look like physically, whether we'll even be allowed in the building, what committees will look like, and the degree to which those are in person or virtual. So I think with that, those are all of my disclaimers. And so I'm going to run through just three of the main groups that are discussing, that are proposing some criminal justice reform legislation and recommendations for next session. These are going to be the Kansas Sentencing Commission, the Pretrial Justice Task Force, and the Criminal Justice Reform Commission. There are certainly others, the Governor's Commission on Racial Equity and Justice, but I'm going to kind of focus on these big three that are getting their proposals ready to go for the 2021 legislature. I know Mike provided you with a memo that we'd sent a while back that includes a list, I think, on that first page, or I don't know what, depending on if it's in a packet, I don't know the page number, but it lists several items that we have discussed with the county and items that are being discussed across several of these groups. A lot of them related to what you've been talking about this morning in terms of reducing recidivism, reducing incarceration, and increasing funding for community-based services, and especially lots of conversations about mental health and SUD treatment. So with that, I'll start with the Kansas Sentencing Commission. And in our memo, I've kind of listed out some of the proposed legislation on there. I won't go through all of it. And I've also included the link to the full legislation. I know some of those things on there are probably of particular interest to different people on this commission, but I'll point out just a few. Some of them should look familiar, probably to some of you. With the 2019 session being cut so short, a lot of these that the Kansas Sentencing Commission had proposed last year had gotten partway through the process, but then ended up dying because of we went home in March. So a couple of these from last year, I think, should look familiar. There's one dealing with increasing the felony loss thresholds for certain property crimes, and then a number related to mental health and drug treatment, including expanding the Senate Bill 123 program for people on diversion, as well as modifying the care and treatment law to allow courts to prohibit possession of a firearm in a temporary custody order pursuant to the Care and Treatment Act for people with mental health concerns, and a couple of others related to good time credits and early prison release for certain drug offenders. I'll move on next to the Pretrial Justice Task Force. I believe your DA is on this, so I'm sure he is much better equipped to answer any questions that you might have on these than I am. They have several recommendations. I believe your report, or your preliminary report, was about 150 pages. So skimming through these, I picked out just a few that, based on our conversations with the county, I figured might be of particular interest. Again, a lot of these seem to be focused on mental health and drug treatment. One of the recommendations is encouraging law enforcement to work with community mental health providers for quick identification and referral of offenders with mental health and SUD needs to appropriate community resources. I think this is also kind of tied to some conversations that lots of these groups are having about co-responders and mobile crisis units. So we're keeping an eye on all of those conversations. Another recommendation that kind of is also related to the Crisis Center, but that KDADS is looking at issuing regulations for the Crisis Intervention Act so that crisis centers can be licensed, which would allow law enforcement the ability to immediately connect individuals to effective care. They also have a recommendation related to drug treatment for people in diversion programs for drug-related offenses. And then lastly, I'll talk a little bit about the Board of Indigent Defense Services. They have been looking at a more holistic approach to the public defense and having defense counsel at first appearance. So this was a recommendation also included in the Pretrial Justice Task Force. I know, though, that this holistic approach that they're trying to do, I know that they have to have funding and personnel needs met. First, they were presenting to the Legislative Budget Committee last week, and it sounds like between their funding and their caseload averages, which are far above national levels, national averages, I think they have to get some of that worked out before they can really drill down into this issue. But this is something that lots of these committees are looking at. The last group I'm going to talk about and what they're discussing is the Criminal Justice Reform Commission. I would start by saying they have not formalized any of their recommendations quite yet. You'll notice that there are 6 subcommittees on this commission. This is a big group. And those subcommittees have to get their recommendations in by October 26th. And then they'll spend the first couple of weeks of November finalizing and prioritizing those before they then submit their final report to the legislature December 1st. I would also add they've been meeting since 2019. They were authorized to meet throughout the rest of this year, and then they were scheduled to end. I know that the chairman of that, Mark Bennett from Sedgwick County, is attempting to get a 1-year renewal for that. So I wouldn't be surprised if that happens. So might have another year or more, who knows, discussing these issues. So much like with the Sentencing Commission, a lot of these should look familiar because unfortunately, some of these bills got about halfway through the process. I believe a number of them even passed the House, and then COVID came along. And so those will be reintroduced this year. I will go through just a couple of those. I don't know as I put them in my memo, so I did want to mention them. But there's a number dealing with the expansion of diversion programs, increasing the felony loss threshold, as well as several related to driver's license issues, which I know is an issue that you all have been talking about at the county. So these were dealing with issues including revising fees associated with restricted licenses, amending the 90-day suspension period that accompanies reinstatement, and allowing courts to waive mandatory fines and fees for indigent persons charged with traffic infractions. So I've listed the 6 subcommittees. I won't necessarily comb through all of them, but I'll hit a couple of highlights for what some of them are talking about. The Behavioral Health Subcommittee is focused on, in addition to increasing access to those community resources, they're also focusing on leveraging access to telehealth, which, as we've seen with COVID, we have enjoyed some flexibilities with telehealth. And so I think this committee is focused on leveraging those to increase access to telebehavioral health. The Reentry Subcommittee is also focused on housing, employment, and educational opportunities to get people connected with community services as they reenter the community. Supervision Group is focusing on things to address dual supervision, including the consolidation of supervision. The Proportionality Subgroup is focused mainly on expanding diversion options, looking at non-drug sentencing, and making revocation sentencing more proportional. And lastly, I'll just mention briefly about the Race and the Criminal Justice Subcommittee. They have only met, I think, once or twice. They were only appointed recently this year. They were not part of the initial 2019 subcommittees. So they're just kind of getting their feet underneath them, but they've been discussing some of the issues that we've talked about today, the public defense at First Council, as well as there seems to be some parallel conversations that they're having with the Governor's Commission on Racial Equity and Justice as well. So wrapping up, I know that was probably a lot of information, but we wanted to make sure that we were able to give you sort of a big picture view of what's happening now. We know that ultimately the county is the one to narrow these down and set priorities and kind of set the direction for which we'll go. At this point, you know, our responsibility and strategy is to keep you all informed of all of the relevant decisions that are going to be happening over the next couple of months in preparation for the 2021 session, as well as making sure you all are aware of educational opportunities and opportunities to share your expertise and testify, especially as the legislature prepares to come back. Based on your discussion this morning, you know, I think a great opportunity and one that we mentioned with Mike and Matt last week was all of this work that you're doing with the racial and ethnic work group and the data analysis that you're doing. That would be a prime example, I think, of getting in front of some of these legislative committees to discuss those issues. So you'll see at the very end of our memo, I know that we're new for a lot of you, so we even went ahead and included our contact information. So please always feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions. And I'm happy to answer any questions at this point. And I see that Stuart has jumped on as well. So please let us know if you have anything you want to chat about.
This is Sarah. I just want to thank Stuart and Mallory for being on the agenda today and sharing this information with the CJCC. As Mallory said, you know, the county is slowly going to begin to get ready for our legislative platform. You know, CJCC would not have that given the many roles that this body serves. But if there are particular issues, you know, that are important that we can monitor, to me, it's less about what's on the platform and more about how can we be prepared, have Stuart and Mallory looking for things as they come up in the legislature? How can we connect to groups you're already connected to make sure we can all support each other's work in this place? We appreciate your full participation in that.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. As I said in the email that our goal is to provide this information to the council so that you're informed, while the council will not take an advocacy role as a group. I know many of you will, and so we can provide you with data as to what is happening in Topeka. Then we definitely want to do that and provide that support.
Thank you.
Sorry, I muted. We had a lot of noise back here. Thank you very much for the presentation. I thought it was really helpful to get an overview of what's going on in the state. Obviously, if any of the members are interested, they can reach out to you and ask any additional questions they might have. Do we have any other comments, suggestions, or recommendations today? Anything else we need to do for the good of the order? Seeing none, I'm going to call this meeting adjourned. Thank you for everyone's participation today. Thank you.